Prepare yourself for a romp through 80s action movies with author Austin Trunick.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, I really hope you know who I am by now. I am the Random Tables guy. I create random tables to help game masters run better sessions at the table. You can find them at DiceGeeks.com, Amazon.com, or DriveThruRPG.com. And if you want to, you can just type in the Book of Random Tables in Google and you will find it. I have a whole series of those books, ranging from fantasy to cyberpunk to science fiction and more. You know, I just wanted to take a second really quick and talk about the podcast a little bit. I have been doing this podcast now since September 2019. I really enjoy it. I love talking to all of the people that I get to talk to, some phenomenal game designers, amazing creatives, and I love it. However, if you want me to keep making this show, I need some help, guys. I need some ratings, reviews, and some subscribers in Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on Stitcher, and other platforms where you might be listening to this podcast. Those things just help the show out a ton, and I really need your help. Like I said, if I'm going to keep making this podcast, I need your support. And some of those things are just pressing a button. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, think about giving it a review, a rating, or subscribing to it. I would really appreciate it. Also, to keep making this show, I really need your help on Patreon. I know times can be tough out there, but if you are in a position to support the show financially, I would greatly appreciate it. You can head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and learn how to support the show. That would mean the world to me, and any support I receive there will just go right back into making this the best podcast that I can. Okay, guys, enough of all that. Here's the interview for today. My guest today is the author of the Canon Film Guide, Austin Trunick. Austin, welcome to the show.
Hey, Matt, thank you so much for having me.
No, absolutely. It is my pleasure. Well, you know, I did say here that you are the author of the Canon Film Guide, and I know there are some people out there who hear those words and know exactly what we're talking about, but I know there are going to be some people who are not sure, you know, about what Canon Films is or was. And, you know, I do have to say, you know, I've already interviewed Sam Furstenberg on the podcast, and I admitted during that episode that probably circa 1988, I would have been like 14-ish. I would have told you that Chuck Norris was my favorite actor and that Canon Films made all of my favorite movies. And so I'm on record for saying that. Why don't you give us kind of just a quick idea? What was Canon Films?
Well, when people talk about Canon Films, as we're discussing them now, we're usually talking about Canon in the 1980s and early 90s. And that is Canon after they were taken over by Israeli cousins, Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus. They were these two very, very successful Israeli film producers, really the most successful producers to come out of their industry. And for years, they were looking for a way to get into the US market and to crack it. And they did so by buying Canon, which was a failing New York film company, really that was known for making some grindhouse movies, importing a lot of, for lack of a better word, foreign pornography and redubbing it and giving it new subtitles and so on and so forth. They bought Canon in 1979 and started producing their own movies in Hollywood in 1980. And their way of doing it was really, really kind of genius for the era. They hit it at the right time. Menachem Golan was the creative side of this duo, this two-headed monster, and Yoram Globus was the money guy, the financial guy, and really was brilliant. They made all their movies by basically taking ideas, usually with mocked up artwork, maybe a poster that someone in their art department had drawn up. Sometimes actors' names attached, sometimes a tagline. Those were always subject to change. But they would take these to film markets and film festivals, stuff like Cannes and AFM, and they would pre-sell them. They would sell the movie to, let's say, for example, they had an idea for a movie starring Charles Bronson. They didn't have a plot, they didn't have a script. They knew they had Charles Bronson for one film. They would take the poster and they would sell it to Italy, they would sell it to Germany, they would sell it to Japan. They would sell the US video rights and they would sell the cable rights, because this was right at the time all of these things were becoming actual money makers for studios, and Canon really jumped on that. And once they had sold enough, say $10 million worth of sales, they would then produce the Charles Bronson movie for $5 million. So it allowed them to make a lot of these low budget to middle budget action, horror, low budget sex comedies, things like that. And really, it didn't matter if these movies did well or not in theaters, because they had already made the profits and taken that and made even more movies. So Canon came along at a time, especially when the video market, the home video and rentals really boomed, and they filled that space with really all the movies that you and I, coming from this generation of people who grew up in a video store, recognized and were magnetized towards and fell in love with.
I don't think, well, of course I didn't, when I was a kid in the 80s, I had no idea. I wanted to work in movies. I wanted to work for Canon, but I had no idea what was going on behind the scenes or anything like that, of course. And, now as I've gotten older and I've watched some documentaries and I've learned more about the history, it's like it was a movie, behind the scenes, right? You just couldn't even imagine some of the stuff that they were doing, right?
Right. That's the whole reason I embarked on this project about researching and writing about these films, because the stories behind them are often, believe it or not, crazier than what was on screen.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of blew me away to learn some of that. But, like I said, already, it was just some of these movies were just just like my favorite movies, because they were just doing stuff that the big, studios weren't doing, right? They were just, say the ninja craze kind of, and we can talk about that a little bit, ninja movies, a huge craze during the 80s, or even the, American ninja, right? Even crossing that with America, the ninja, the whole thing, I think I told Sam Furstenberg, right? If you just come up with the title American Ninja, I've already bought the movie ticket, right? You just, it doesn't even matter what is in the movie, right? The title just sells the movie. And that's kind of what they were working with, what you were saying, right?
Right. Their ability to sell movies based on an idea or a flashy piece of artwork. And thinking back to those days when you're going through the video stores, the Canon movies, their boxes, they knew how to make an exciting box. Just a cover. They could sell you with a name and artwork. And again, they worked in genres that, especially young boys, young males would naturally gravitate towards. You had your ninja movies and your, Chuck Norris holding a gigantic gun. That's something that's a lot of young men in the 80s would see, and yeah, that's what they would take to the shelf, and they would pay their 99 cents to take home with them for the weekend.
Also, back then, the not renting rated R movies to anybody under 17 was not enforced. I don't think ever. I don't know.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. My own video store. I think back to when I was probably 12, 13 years old. I'm thinking middle school times, and going and renting movies. And yeah, we could get all of the Canon action films. The only thing we couldn't walk out with, which it seemed funny, was if there was any clear sexual content. That was the one time I feel like the store clerks would kind of hold the R-rated movies keep them out of hands. We couldn't rent The Last American Virgin, for example, for Canon movies, but we could take home hospital massacre or Enter the Ninja, or anything which was violent and as gory as possible. They didn't care. It was,
Yeah.
But if there was a little bit of nudity in there, it was a little tougher to get out of the store with, at least in my experience.
Yeah. I think I don't even remember. I think I was only asked once, and they said, like, would your parents mind if you rented this? And I was just like, no. And they said, okay. And it was like, that was the extent of the the controls on the rated R movie.
Right.
There. And so it was just like, oh, okay. Yeah. And like we're saying with some of these movies, like, and it maybe some people, we've mentioned a few of the ninja movies and stuff, but of course, the Chuck Norris movies, like Missing in Action, those would be Canon movies. Masters of the Universe, the He-Man live action adaptation, was a Canon film, and which I went and saw in the theater, and I thought it was amazing. But you were absolutely right when you said that, like, they just knew how to sell the movie, right? And in the video store, their covers, their posters, that cover art on the VHS box, it just caught your eye, and it had all those elements, like you were saying, for a teenage boy in the 80s. It was like a huge American flag, Chuck Norris with a huge gun, and you're just like, well, I'm seeing that movie, right? Like,
absolutely.
This is like that's like just a no-brainer, right? Or even some other trends that may seem a little out there, but like the breakdancing craze. They had breakdancing movies, but again, that was just all part of the 80s, and it was just kind of right into those trends that were going on right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Canon, they were good about jumping on trends, and people look at them as sort of jumping onto whatever's popular right as it's not that popular anymore. You look at something like, they finally made the Masters of the Universe movie after the cartoon was off the air and the toy line was in its last dying gasps.
Yeah.
But for the breakdancing, they had that idea to make a breakdancing movie. They found out their competition was working on Beat Street, and they made breaking faster. They just got it into theaters first. Yeah. And that was a huge hit for them. And it exposed a lot of, some of the widest exposure for breakdancing in a lot of the country was through that movie. And yeah, so sometimes they were jumping on trends. Sometimes they were actually on top of these trends before other people got to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of those trends, and we mentioned it a little bit, but we could go into it a little bit deeper, was the ninja craze. Mm-hmm. And their movie Enter the Ninja, which of course is, Enter the Dragon, kind of, the title right there. And let's say an allusion to the Bruce Lee film. But like Enter the Ninja, really kind of kicked off this 80s ninja craze, right?
It did. As far as ninjas in Western film, you can look at the Octagon. The Chuck Norris movie had some ninja bad guys in it. There's a Bond movie with a kind of ninja-like villain in it for a little bit. But Enter the Ninja took the idea of ninjas and put them front and center. That came to Canon through martial artist Mike Stone, who is really a legendary figure in martial arts. One of the most longest undefeated streaks in competition. He holds a lot of world records. He's in the Hall of Fame, but he had sort of gotten out. He had trained Priscilla Presley famously, but he had come to Canon sort of later after he was done competing, and with this idea for basically a script that became Enter the Ninja eventually, and it had another name. It was going to be another title at that time. Malcolm Golan got it eventually and saw it as, your opportunity to sort of make, and Enter the Dragon knockoff. But that became its own beast. This movie took off, and a lot of the things that are in there did. I mean, it did kick off this ninja phenomenon of the 80s. You saw them everywhere, but even certain details. You have posters that show Kasugi, who was the villain in that one, became the star of later Canon films. his certain poses, you can see. There's a great website, actually, if anyone is interested in this, to check it out. It's called Vintage Ninja, run by Keith Rainville. And he has a whole section called Kasugi Kicks. And it's just all these different video covers, video game covers, magazine covers, where it's illustrations that look as if they had just traced over famous like publicity stills and posters from Enter the Ninja, which is just amazing because he has this collection that's gigantic and it's so fun to go through. But certain things like you think of ninja weapons, the nunchuck isn't traditionally something a ninja would have used. It wouldn't have made sense historically or anything like that. But Menachem Golan had seen Enter the Dragon. He'd seen Bruce Lee use it in movies. He wanted nunchucks in his movies, so they work them into. There's Sho Kosugi demonstrating one at the beginning, and since then, because of that, even though it's historically inaccurate, it's become a part of the pop culture ninja arsenal. Michelangelo, Ninja Turtles, would not have had a nunchuck had Enter the Ninja not got that wrong first.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was funny when I was, learning about some of that I just thought that was funny. But yeah, I mean, we, like me and my older brother and some of my cousins, like we had to have nunchucks. Like we made some, right? Like out of boards and like whipped them around and like hit ourselves in the head and stuff. And we just had no clue, but it was like, they were just so cool. Right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and of course they look fantastic on film, right? I mean, you see, of course, Bruce Lee or, so Kasugi, with nunchucks, and you're just like, well, that's amazing, right? That's just incredible, so the way it just looks on film,
I don't know, I'm not a weapons expert in any means, but I don't know if there's a wider range of someone looking very cool with nunchucks and looking very bad when they don't know how to use them. I don't know if there's any weapon that you could put in somebody's hand and know how skilled or non-skilled they were with it than a nunchuck. Yeah.
Case in point, Enter the Ninja versus Francisco Nero, right?
Oh yeah, Franco Nero. Yeah.
Oh, Franco Nero. Sorry, I got his name wrong. I'm sorry. There is clips from both of them using it, and you can tell which one knows how to use nunchucks.
Right, and which one was handed it for the first time on the day of filming.
Yes, and told, do something with this. Yes, yes, and no fault to Mr. Nero there, but because it is very difficult.
I think anybody who watched a ninja movie, in our age group, I'm sure, learned how difficult they were to use correctly.
Oh, yes.
Very quickly.
Yeah, that's like I said, like we always hit ourselves in the head or somewhere else that was worse, I guess. And we were trying to learn how to do them, and then we would just throw them down and then go watch the movie again or something. But yes, and to me, I just find it interesting, just to where all of these things kind of come from. Of course, years past and like another lifetime, I was like I tried to be a screenwriter and a filmmaker, and I was so I'm always fascinated by film history and a lot of these movies where some of these things come from, of course. So then we get the kind of the ninja craze. So we have the ninja movies going, and then of course we get American Ninja, which is obviously like, looking at it, like I said earlier, this sells the movie ticket right there. But it's just like, I mean, that's just the next move to, making, a movie for the American audience, right? It's just like,
absolutely.
Well, let's just make the ninja an American, but it's like, it's so simple, but it's like genius, right? Mm-hmm. It's just like a genius move, when you're making a movie. I just thought that was is this like just so incredible, that it's just like an awareness of your audience that you're making movies for, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's amazing that these patriotic movies were made by, generally they came from men who or people who weren't from the United States, weren't born here originally, which is incredible.
Yeah.
because you have Golden Globus. You have an amazing filmmaker such as Sam Furstenberg, who came to Hollywood after learning everything in Tel Aviv and in Israel, which is, it's just amazing to think that, it's just being so in tune with your audience. You really have to appreciate how much they knew who they were making these films for.
Yeah, absolutely. And and I think that point is really powerful, because it's just like, how do you do that? How do you go to some other country and just realize that it's like, oh, I will combine, ninja with, with this, and, wrap it in the flag of that country, and it turns out to be great, or whatever. Like how do you figure that out? And yes, just from being from someplace else, because they hit like just all the right notes, especially in American Ninja, which wasn't even filmed in the United States. It was filmed in the Philippines. And which I thought was kind of a masterstroke, was, making him, making it set on a U.S. Army base and making him a member of the Army was just like, well, there you go. That was perfect. Yeah. And so, it's just incredible, the kind of the marketing sense, right? Just the understanding, like you said, of the audience with some of those films. And I don't know what it was right at that time. It was just hitting so well. I mean, we were talking about nunchucks, but like Chinese throwing stars, we always had to have, we had to have throwing stars, and we almost put our eyes out with those, trying to get them to stick into trees, which we could never get to do. And I mean, just, all kinds of stuff like that. It was just like, I don't know. It was just some kind of perfect storm, really.
And that's actually what, this is a little bit of a digression here, but in the UK, when all of these films were released, the BBFC would take the films and trim out certain parts that were not appropriate there. So it's funny, you look at a film like American Ninja, and in the UK, it's not much shorter. It's very small trims, but the trims are things like they went through and took out all the ninja stars, and their thinking was that it would be too tempting for children to imitate. They were afraid that British children would see these movies and end up putting each other's eyes out with ninja stars. So things, and the nunchucks were another thing that were strangely trimmed out of the British cuts of movies, because it's something like a kid can make their own nunchucks. That's
and we did all of those things.
Right. Candlesticks. I remember as a kid having the holiday candles, the tall ones that came. They would come. You'd have to cut the wick in the middle, but before that, they were basically wax and nunchucks.
Yeah.
I remember using them as such. Yeah.
I know what you're talking about there too. I know we had I guess it was like a 1x1 like board, and we cut it, and then we put a little a chain in between it, and oh my gosh, it was crazy. And then I think our parents saw it and thought we were nuts, and thought we were going to kill ourselves. And, probably not too wrong, but, nobody died, there were no deaths and nobody lost an eye, but, we came close a few times. We had a few stars fly past our heads, like trying to stick them into trees, like I said, and having them bounce off. That was always the thing. Like, you just never knew where it was going to go, because we could, just never get them to stick into a tree like they did in the movies. But I don't know. That's like a pretty big digression there. But I guess some of the other, like what I didn't really understand until, I guess it was fairly recently, within the last few years, was that Canon Films like ended up signing a deal with Chuck Norris, and they just were like, his movie was going to be a Canon film. And I didn't realize that, but, of course, thinking back, I'm like, well, all of these Chuck Norris movies are put out by Canon. I didn't realize like that he was, really like under contract for them after something like 83 or something like that. And I just found that interesting. I wasn't even thinking about that, but that was a pretty interesting move for Canon Film to make, right?
Right. What's funny about Canon in the 80s, Golden Globus came and they approached it really very similarly to the old studio system, the old Hollywood studio system of the 30s, 40s, 50s, which was pretty much dead by the 70s. And they were here trying to keep it going in the 80s, back when you could have stars under contract for so many films, when really most of the studios weren't doing that anymore. But yeah, they signed Chuck Norris to several deals. They kept extending them. I think their longest one with him was 7 years.
Wow.
Of basically a movie a year during that time. They had signed Charles Bronson was another one. They kept signing for longer and longer contracts. Michael Dudikoff. Once they found somebody who was really great for what they were trying to do, really fit their mold, especially when it came to action films, that they could put in one action film after another, because they knew that was what was paying the bills. Really, they would lock those guys down. And yeah, not many places did that at that time. And Canon, they really operated as if they were a 30s, 40s studio. That's what they aspired to. And again, I think that's what makes them special. That makes them different from anybody else that was operating at the time.
Yeah. And of course, the Chuck Norris movies, I mean, there were, so many, the missing in action films I mentioned. There was also Firewalker, kind of an Indiana Jones kind of feel to that one. And there were, obviously some others, and that some that tried to break the mold a little bit.
Oh, Chuck with Firewalker is an interesting one, because that's a film I've been writing about for the second volume. That one has, as far as Chuck movies, it covers the Delta Force films, covers Firewalker. Firewalker is funny because Chuck was even though he was signing these contracts with Canon, he recognized that he was getting into his really middle ages. He was 45 years old by the time he started making films then. That's by the time he really became a film star. And he had been making these martial arts films for lots of various small studios, independent productions. And he had been shopping around Missing in Action, basically trying to get it made, because he didn't want to get stuck into just doing karate movies. He thought that would be the death of his career, especially as he was aging. He wanted to be able to use guns and things like that. Invasion USA. So he makes this deal with Canon that kind of makes him into more of a hybrid action star. He's still roundhouse kicking people. He's still punching them. It's all the stuff we love about Chuck Norris movies, but he's breaking it up. He's also shooting at them. Is the biggest difference. He doesn't have his boots don't have to do all the talking. It's in those films. But as the Canon movies were going on, he did Missing in Action 2, Invasion USA, Delta Force, all right in a space of 3 years. Less than. So it's one movie after another. And he's at that point, he decided he wanted to keep trying to broaden what he could do. So he kind of felt he was getting pigeonholed into these Chuck Norris style Canon action movies. So Firewalker comes along. It's a script that wasn't even intended to be made. The screenwriter had sent it to Canon as just basically a sample of his work. And it was basically, he wanted to write a movie that was like Indiana Jones and like Romancing the Stone, because that was what was popular right then. That was what studios were looking for. And it was really just a sample, but Chuck somehow got a hold of this script that was sitting around the Canon offices, saw it, loved it, and decided it was going to be his next movie. And it's funny because you look at the press releases going out at the time, and Canon's press release begins with Chuck Norris in a comedy? ? You better believe it. So it's like it's as if Canon's marketing group was even kind of confused. That what Chuck Norris we made this? This is it strikes me as funny, but Firewalker is an enjoyable film, and it's definitely different than Chuck's other works for them. And he gets Lou Gossett Jr. in there. It was just a few years off of an Oscar at that point, which is incredible. Good cast.
Yeah, and yeah, Louis Gossett Jr. was great, and yeah, they were kind of a buddy archaeology team, kind of or adventure Tomb Raider kind of thing, all kind of rolled into one in that movie. Of course, you mentioned Invasion USA, and talk about another movie that just like hit like the exact like feel and time of the 80s, right? Like here is, Invasion USA, like the Soviets are going to invade and Chuck Norris is going to roundhouse kick them out. Right. Like,
right.
And that movie was just again, it's just like, I guess building off of, say, Red Dawn or something like that. That movie was just like the title sells the movie ticket, and then it's just icing on the cake when it's Chuck Norris, kicking the Soviets out of America, right?
Yeah, and it's another that movie you can look at as a great, I think it's just a great example of a Canon movie, because they squeeze so much production value out of their budget. It was a larger budget than most of the other Chuck Norris films that Canon made, but it's still a very small budget compared to any studio action movie. But that movie shot a lot of it right outside of Atlanta. And there's certain scenes. There's two scenes I want to think of. I think of, for example, there's a scene in there where the leader of this terrorist group that is invading the USA, hence Invasion USA, rides into this small, basically suburban neighborhood cul-de-sac area. He lifts a rocket launcher on his shoulder. They have all these people decorating for Christmas all around. They're in their houses. They're hanging lights. Everybody's in the whole neighborhood seems to be decorating for the holidays at the exact same time. And he lifts a rocket launcher and he just starts blowing up these houses. And what's incredible about that is Canon Joe Zito and James Bruner, the screenwriter, were going to scout locations, and they found this suburban neighborhood which had been bought up by the Atlanta airport, and it was about to be bulldozed to make room to expand, add more airstrips. So they basically paid money to the Atlanta airport to have the permission to blow those houses up. So those are all houses that people had been living in just, probably just a matter of months beforehand. So it gives it this real realism that any studio, they would have built a bunch of facades on somewhere and blown those up. These are actual houses that Canon found a way to cheaply blow up, cheaper than they could build fake houses. And there's a scene in a shopping mall where Chuck Norris is shooting guys he's got the two dual wielding Uzis, shooting guys, hanging off the side of a truck. At one point, there's a truck driving through this mall. They found one of the big shopping malls in the Atlanta area had a whole wing that was going to be remodeled. They were gutting it to renovate the whole thing. And so Canon got permission to come in, and they said, you can destroy it any way you want. We're going to rip all this stuff up anyway. So in both of those cases, after they had the location, James Bruner could go in and write scenes around them, write these action scenes that took place in these specific locations. And it's incredible production value, because a big studio would have found a way to fake it, and it would have been much more expensive. Then they would have had to hire so many carpenters and so many different groups and spend so much to make something that probably wouldn't look as real as what Canon pulled off on such a small budget. And also because Canon worked fast. These places, Canon didn't have much of a window. They'd make a movie, and within 6 months to a year, they'd have it in theaters. And so if the production came in and this place, I would imagine this small suburban town area from Invasion USA, I wouldn't have been surprised if the bulldozers were just parked somewhere off camera waiting to bulldoze it. And Canon's like, we can shoot here in 2 weeks. Like, just wait for us.
Yeah. And I think that's really good that you, kind of brought those out, because those sequences in Invasion USA are real, right? Like they look so real. It's just absolutely right that it was just like, another studio would have faked it somehow, and you could have, even if they had poured millions and millions of dollars into it, you could tell it had a little air of, of movie studio-ish kind of stuff to it. But like the sequence, like the guy just opens up with his rocket launcher, and you're just like, he is blowing up just normal people. Like, this is crazy. You can't do this, kind of thing. And the shopping mall sequence too is just fantastic. It's you're just there. You're just really in that place. Like, you're just not on a set. Like, you can just tell that you're in the location. Right. And it was just awesome. Of course, we've kind of touched on a few. Of course, there's somebody else like Jean-Claude Van Damme, of course, starts appearing in Canon films. The most notable one would be, say, Bloodsport, right? That was so huge for me and my friends kind of in the middle school / going into high school era. I mean, we were just obsessed with this idea of secret martial art tournaments being held around the world. And, of course, like most of my childhood, it turned out to be fake, but, it was just it was just so cool. Right. Like, and to hear things about, I guess there were some stories about like that they shot it and it was bad and they had to retool it and stuff. But I mean, the movie comes out and it was a huge hit for Canon. Right.
Right. And unfortunately, it came a little too late there. By that time, people were injecting money into them just to keep them alive. But I mean, Canon was on really after 1987, once they really get into serious financial trouble, they were on life support for the next almost a decade after that, just through the name and through different companies buying them. And the name was alive. Some of the people were still there, but it was strange. But yeah, Bloodsport's an interesting story because it is frustrating because it was a movie that was greenlit during Canon's really the peak. I would say 86 going into 87 was the peak period when things had the brightest outlook for their future. But then they got it back and it was Menachem Golan thought it was unreleasable. And so they let Jean-Claude Van Damme. This is where I really have to give him a lot of credit he's a fun martial arts actor. He's a great action star, but he's also very smart about movies. He's a big movie fan. He's watched a lot of films. I've spoken to him and, he's a fan of Bruce Lee, but also Jean-Paul Belmondo, the French action / comedy, and someone who he always wanted to aspired to be like. He wanted to be somebody who was not just known for his kicks and his splits, obviously, but for being funny. And it's something that he didn't really get to use as much. And his accent and his English being a second language was, I think, very hard for him in his career. He kind of got pigeonholed into these very specific roles as he became a bigger and bigger star. But more recent years, you get to see him do more comedy. You look at things like Jean-Claude Van Johnson, which is a series he did for Amazon a few years ago, which was really, really funny. But yeah, so they let him go in there with one of their house editors, and he sat in the Canon offices and he re-edited all the fight scenes with them, went and added the things like, really, Bloodsport does a thing that you see in a lot of Hong Kong movies, but Van Damme knew from watching those, where you see him punch, then you see the punch again at a slightly different speed and at a slightly different angle. He uses every take of the exact same motion, but on film, on screen, on Bloodsport, you get to see him. It just increases the impact by showing it to the audience over and over and over again. And Van Damme, to his credit, had all of those put in there and really made what, in my opinion, is one of the best martial arts movies. And a lot of that is not just him on screen, but him as an assistant editor on that film, basically. Yeah. His contributions. He ended up doing the same thing on Cyborg. He went in and helped recut some action some of the action scenes on that to sort of punch him up.
Mhm.
So very, he's much more, I think, intelligent in the regards to filmmaking than a lot of people would ever think to give him credit for.
Yeah, and I mean, that's just an interesting point by itself. That's almost, tangential to what we're talking about. But like, I think that is true with, say, Schwarzenegger, Stallone, obviously.
Oh yeah.
Van Damme. That they have this, the big muscly,
Right.
kind of exterior, and especially
Right.
like Stallone with like the voice and stuff, and
Yeah.
and then you realize that, like, Stallone is like one of the best filmmakers there is, right? Like he's
Right.
like, top like 30, 20 in the world, right? Like this is not a joke,
People want to see these meatheads and they want to conflate them with the characters they play on screen. And
Yeah.
really, these are really smart guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And absolutely. Yeah. They think, oh, well, he's, he is Rocky, right? He's kind of the dim-witted boxer enforcer guy who doesn't know what he's doing or whatever. And you're like, no, he wrote that. He half directed of most of them, and he's a smart guy. And so
there's a great anecdote I love from when Stallone was making Over the Top with Canon, which was directed by Menachem Golan, who was Canon's head honcho.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of people said, like, a lot of the press was kind of feeding this rumor that it was Stallone himself that was directing it, while Golan was just sort of, that Stallone was overriding him a lot. And somebody had finally brought it up during an interview on set. I believe maybe it was the Washington Post doing their big story. They had a lot of journalists on set for that one. Asked Golan, are you directing this or is Stallone? And he had said, well, I'm directing it, but if Stallone wants to offer advice, I'm going to listen to him. He's like, I've been making movies for almost 30 years at this point, but Stallone, he's Rocky, the Rambo movies. He has such an influence on those. He's made more money than at the box office based on what his artistic choices than I have with this entire company. He was very aware of that, and I'm impressed, willing to say it on the record.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting, especially when we hear about, the movie business being notorious for egos and things, to have somebody just say, well, hey, he's good at what he does. I'm going to listen to somebody who's good at what they do. Mm-hmm. And of course, Stallone also made Cobra with Canon, right?
Cobra is a really tricky one. It does get it has the Golden Globus producers at the beginning, but so what happened there was Canon working under the studio system, working in the vein of the old studio system. Mm-hmm. They, in 1984, they signed a giant contract with Sylvester Stallone, who at the time was one of the biggest stars in the world, and especially like in the 80s in particular.
Oh yeah.
He'd be having both the Rocky and Rambo franchises behind him, plus everything else he's seeming to do very well.
Yeah.
They go and they were going to sign him a $10 million contract to make him the highest paid actor in Hollywood to star in Over the Top, which was a script that Menachem Golan had had for years and wanted to get made and was looking for the right star. It was his baby. And Stallone agrees, but he'd want to direct it himself because he liked the script, but Golan wanted to do it. So he said, okay, I'll let Golan direct it. You can direct it if you pay me $2 million more. So Canon went with it, and they said $12 million. They made Sylvester Stallone a record-breaking contract, an exclusive contract with Canon for $12 million. But $12 million is not something it's not money Canon has sitting around because normally with $12 million, they'd make 3 Chuck Norris movies. Mm-hmm. So they don't have $12 million. All the papers publish the story. They take out the ads, the billboards. Welcome to the Canon family. Sylvester Stallone, highest paid actor in Hollywood, exclusive with Canon. They don't have $12 million to give him. So they give him $500,000 as a retainer, and they go out to the film markets and all their foreign buyers looking for a way to drum up this money. They need $12 million to pay Stallone and probably another $12 to $13 million to actually make the film. So the same amount that they're paying Stallone to pay for everything else in the rest of the movie. And so at that point, like the exclusive didn't cover this. He made a Rambo sequel in that time. It didn't include the movies he already had in the works. But they got to the end, and it took them years to do it because companies were skeptical. They believed in Stallone. Stallone was a big box office guy, but they didn't quite believe in this arm wrestling, truck driving, buddy adventure film. So finally, they get to the end of this. Stallone still is exclusive, but they can't pay him. So there's kind of this pause where something needs to happen for something to continue. And Cobra came about. It was actually a script that began as Beverly Hills Cop when Stallone was involved in it. He was going to star in Beverly Hills Cop, and he rewrote it because he didn't want it to be a comedy. So he took the Beverly Hills Cop script, rewrote it, removed all the comedy, made it very serious. It becomes Cobra. Mm-hmm. And he wants to make this movie. Warner Brothers wants to make the movie with him, but they can't because of Canon's exclusive. Finally, the deal is made that Warner Brothers will help Canon finally pay Stallone to make the movie. They will co-produce over the top. They'll distribute it. They'll handle a lot. They hand over a lot of money to Canon. They also get the rights to a lot of Canon's upcoming films, the video rights. That's why you see a lot of stuff on Warner Home Video for the Canon films. And they get to make Cobra. And so basically, because Canon is the kind of egg on their face at that point, they're kind of embarrassed because their exclusive is no longer an exclusive. Mm-hmm. Warner Brothers lets them come on as producers. So they're not actually on as producers, but their names are on there. It's a vanity credit so that you can still get the Canon name on. So Cobra's interesting because it is very much a Canon movie.
Yeah, yes.
It's everything they do well, but in the actual production of it, they weren't involved other than giving Warner Brothers permission to make it in exchange for their help paying for Over the Top.
Wow. And I and obviously we'll touch on a little bit you're alluding to, and I know I'm talking a long time. I could talk about Canon movies forever, and probably you could.
Oh, me too.
But, because I want to ask you several other things.
Please.
But just a couple things. I know you're alluding to some of the financial problems. We'll get there, but we're talking about some of the classic action movies, and Chuck Norris, and Charles Bronson, even, and Stallone, and that. But one thing that's strange about some of the Canon movies is they had some of the biggest actors in some of these movies, like Sean Connery. Some people that are now household names, like Jonathan Rhys-Davies, from Lord of the Rings, and they. I'm forgetting Meryl Streep, I think, right? Like,
yeah.
They just have like these huge. Some of these huge stars are in some of these movies that you're just like, what was going on? You're just like, okay, I get Chuck Norris doing an action movie for like $4 million or whatever. I get that. But like, oh my gosh, like Sean Connery in, Sword of the Valiant or whatever, and you're just like, what is this? Like it was just like this weird mix of like low budget, but like, like they're trying to do like major highbrow stuff as well or something,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's lots of different reasons why these people would appear in this in Canon films. Mm-hmm. Sean Connery, for example, he was able to film his parts in Sword of the Valiant on the weekends while he was off. When he was shooting Bond, his last Bond film, he was able to go for his vacation. They gave him the weekends off, and he went over and shot his scenes for Canon. Later on, his son appeared in in one of their Canon movie tales, and that kind of was a bit of an exchange there. Okay. But then so many actors who are young and became much more successful. Forrest Whitaker in like Bloodsport.
Yeah.
You have Liam Neeson in Cannon's Duet for One. He plays Julie Andrews' lover, and it's just amazing because he's not even credited on the box for the film, and he's probably the third most significant screen time, but he was like so unknown then that they don't even put his name anywhere on the box.
Yeah.
And because they hired a lot of young people. Mm-hmm. That's something that they were a company that I in the books I talked to a lot of these people were younger stars then, and their agents kept them up to date on what Canon was doing because they knew that Canon would give young people a chance or like new people a chance because they didn't have money to pay the established people.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, it's just fascinating that like Sean Connery's like shooting another movie on the weekends, and you would think like he would be, poolside or something, on the weekends or something. But I just find that fascinating. Of course, I'll, I try to keep some of these movies we're talking about are, of course, rated R, but like I try to keep the podcast a little bit clean. But I know if I'll word this in a little way, if there are some Star Trek fans out there and they want to see more of Marina Sirtis, Counselor Troy, you can look to some Canon films and you will see more of her in a certain sense, if you will, because she was in some of them very early in her career as well. And but it's just kind of crazy that there's this mix of, Sean Connery, who should be on top of the world. I think was Ernest Borgnine in one or two. I think. I mean, it's just it's just incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. They had, and you also had people who.
Lee Marvin, right? He was in Delta Force.
In the Delta Force. You have even Roger Moore in the Naked Face. Speaking of former Bonds.
Yeah.
And I mean, Canon was also good about people came to know that if you had something that you couldn't get made elsewhere, that you could take it to Canon. And Menachem Golan especially was very much, he was easy to appeal with star power. So you have The Naked Face, which is a project that Roger Moore wanted to do, but people could just see him as Bond, and he was able to take that to Canon and get to be in a movie where he was not James Bond, and it was something he wanted to do. Christopher Reeve is another guy who was afraid that people would only ever see him as Superman, and he wanted something that would really try to shatter that Superman image, and he agreed. Unfortunately for him, because Superman 4 was not what he wanted it to be, I'm sure.
Yeah.
What anybody wanted it to be.
Yes.
But in exchange for agreeing to play Superman again, Canon was going to make Street Smart, which is a movie that he was been championing a long time and really wanted to get made, and just nobody else would do it because they didn't see Christopher Reeve in that way. They saw him as Clark Kent, Superman, not as in that film, a guy who gets caught up with a pimp played by Morgan Freeman in his first like breakout, really a role at the age of 50, nominated for a Best Supporting Actor award for that one. But yeah, they didn't see Superman as a guy who was a lying, corrupt journalist who gets caught up with a pimp and like tied up in this world of prostitution. And it was something that, it was a project that was a very dear to Reeve, and Canon did it for him.
Yeah. And you've kind of mentioned some of the financial trouble and stuff that started later, but I kind of want to set the stage too for some people who didn't know, or maybe are too young, some listeners who, like the show Entertainment Tonight, right? Like that used to be very popular, and it would show movies and like making ofs and stuff like this. Canon Films like was on there like all the time, like the Delta Force movie and Invasion USA, and like they just had like huge packages, like just sequences, just like of Chuck Norris behind the scenes and Chuck Norris doing this, and Menachem Golan talking about the movies, and like I think a black tie premiere for Delta Force, like they cover the whole thing with cameras, and they're all there, and like it was just like Canon was everywhere. But then a lot of it turned out to be like a house of cards, right?
Right. They were, I mean, they knew how to market. It all ties back to those video covers and just the coming up with a great title to sell abroad. They knew how to market, and that extended through the press. They couldn't afford to take out, all the TV commercials and things like that. But if they could invite a journalist to their set, the camera crew to come visit as they're filming, that was free coverage, because that's the entertainment at the time wanted that stuff from them, and it was beneficial on both sides. Yeah. But yeah, it was a house of cards. They 85, 86, they really reached their heights. Things looked great, but behind the scenes there were a lot of problems. They were making more and more expensive movies, which really went against the formula that had been so successful for them. If they could pre-sell a Chuck Norris movie or a Charles Bronson movie for 10 million to 15 million and then make it for 5, it didn't matter how well it did. They'd still made a big profit. Mm-hmm. But when they were making movies for 15 million that they had pre-sold for 10 million and then only made 2 million in theaters, then the math becomes a problem for them. There were a lot of films like that. Giving $12 million to Sylvester Stallone is a very peak example of just you're getting away from what works for you. But the other thing that happened that was very much led to their downfall was they took, in 1986, starting at the beginning of 1986, they had basically a line of credit that amounted to about $300 million.
Sheesh.
People believed in Canon. People were bringing projects. You have big stars. They're signing up, even though these films were never made. They had Stallone. They had Dustin Hoffman. They had Al Pacino in line. All these people that they're taking Canon seriously. Canon takes that $300 million line of credit, which should have gone to things like Superman 4 and Masters of the Universe and all these films that you can clearly tell the budget was not there that it needed when they actually went to make it. Mm-hmm. They used it to buy a bunch of stuff they didn't need. And that was the biggest one among those was Thorn EMI, which is a British entertainment company. They spent $270 million on.
Sure.
And that was at the beginning of the summer of 1986, but that included all of their movie theaters. That included their huge catalog of movies, which Canon went and immediately started capitalizing on home video. That's why you see movies like The Evil Dead and the Pee-wee stage special and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with a Canon logo on them, even though you look at the video cover and you're like, why does this have to do with Canon? Mm-hmm. Because for a few months they owned Thor EMI. But the biggest thing that came with that purchase is Elstree Studios, which is very big studio production facility in the UK, which is where Canon filmed Life Force there. They would eventually film Superman 4 there. But you look at movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark, Empire Strikes Back, The Shining, all of these huge movies with these huge sets. These were the sound stages that those were filmed on. And if you're a company like Canon, who at that point your biggest hits were Break-In, Missing in Action, Invasion USA. Mm-hmm. If your specialty is making $5 million action movies, ninja movies in the Philippines and wherever, what do you need with the studio where they shot Empire Strikes Back? What possible use can you put that to? So they spent basically the $300 million that they started the year with. $270 million of that went to buying these production facilities and all these different stuff. And then a year later, they had to sell it. I mean, they had to liquidate it because they were broke. They couldn't afford their movies. Their bookkeeping was out of control. It got real bad real fast.
Yeah. And of course, they did some other things like take over the Cannes Film Festival and spend like $4 million like renting office space and things, and buying ads and trade publications and all kinds of things, and buying like a huge office building in LA, right?
Right. And yeah, it was so Canon, they always called themselves a mini major. Their catalog for 85 says the making of the seventh major studio.
Mhm.
They wanted to compete with your Fox and your Warner Brothers. And they weren't ready for that. They were building, they were successfully, I think a mini major is a good way to describe them because they were making these sort of middle tier movies. They weren't your like shot on video, low budget, no budget independent movies, but they also weren't their studio things, but they filled that perfect market, which they and a few other companies were able to fill video store shelves and fill cable programming with. And yeah, they I think right about that time in 86, they just felt that they had somehow made the jump. That they weren't this mini major anymore. They were suddenly the major, and they needed to have the office space, the fancy office space. They needed to have the big fancy parties. They needed to have all the production facilities that everyone else was jealous of. And I mean, flying too close to the sun, I guess, is the easiest way to say it. They just jumped in too quickly to that size of things.
Little hubris, I guess, but I guess it would. I guess it could go to your head, I guess, a little bit, but with what some of the stuff that they were doing. But I liked your point right there, though. One of your points in there where you said that they weren't just like no budget, independent kind of movies, and they weren't like the big studio movies like. But I don't know if of course I watch tons of movies, and I'm sure you do as well. But and a lot of my listeners do. I know it's just like there are a class of some movies where like, you can tell the people weren't trying and they had low budget and you're just like, it's barely a movie. These are not Canon movies, right? Like the Canon, movies went after it, right? And they were, they took it seriously and were making some, some really good movies that just the studios wouldn't have touched because they thought the market was, wasn't big enough or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Canon also, they had a very kind of backwards way of operating when it came to their sequels. They had, I think it just lends into this, that just sort of for all the things they did very well or they were very smart about, there was just certain things that, I mean, I'm not running a studio, but you look at as somebody who's writing about it, and it's just kind of frustrating because they seem like obvious bad business decisions, but I will never be in a position to make a decision on those scale with millions of dollars on the line. But something with the sequels, we talk about American Ninja, and American Ninja was a fantastic movie, a hit for them. Mm-hmm. It did well. It spawned, there were five of them in the end. They made 5 American Ninja movies, but each one, instead of getting bigger and better, like any studio would do, they'd pump more movie into it because they needed to outdo the previous sequel. Mm-hmm. Canon went smaller. So if you look at American Ninja 2 has also great production value, but it's not quite what American Ninja had. American Ninja had some good money behind it, and it also for Canon, and it had the Filipino crew that had worked on Apocalypse Now, which is incredible. It's like why that movie looks so good is you have a great filmmaker like Sam Furstenberg, but he's working with a local crew that is the same one that had worked with Coppola on Apocalypse Now. Of course, these guys are going to be ready to pull off whatever you ask of them. Yeah. But then American Ninja 2, they move it to South Africa with a less experienced crew and to get cheaper. Mm-hmm. And then 3, you have they go even smaller. And 4, the budget gets smaller. And their part of that is, yes, their financial troubles were really taking a toll, but also some of that was a conscious choice. Instead of looking as how can we outdo the previous movie, they look at, can we hit that same success with less? Yeah. Can we achieve the same thing and spend less? That's how we're going to make more money, not by putting more money into it. But the Death Wish sequels are the same thing. The Delta Force movies are the same thing. It's always that same pattern. Is unfortunately the higher the number you go with a Canon sequel, the lower the budget will get.
Yeah. And that's interesting though, but that's almost like you had mentioned that like they were kind of hearkening back to like the 1930s and stuff, the studios, because that's what the studios did back then, right?
Yeah,
Like
that's a great point. That's exactly how they modeled their business.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you put out King Kong and then you rush out Son of Kong, right? It's cheaper,
Right.
it reuses footage, and and some actors you had under contract really fast, and you just capitalize on that, the kind of the coattails instead of trying to build it into some kind of bigger franchise or something. Like I guess the Rambo movies, right? Each one got like huge, until the newer ones kind of, were small again, I guess. But like the first three, right? Like, were incredible. They just got bigger and bigger. And of course I do have to ask you, I mean, I'm have you on here a long time. I got to ask you about your book. Why don't you tell us about the Canon film guide?
Well, it's these stories that we've been discussing here. I came of age in the video store era. That was a pivotal part of my childhood, and I ended up writing about movies as an adult and sort of moving that and making that. That's what I went to school for. That's what I did professionally, and I was looking for something that I could write on my own time. And Canon is my brain kept coming back to there because these are movies that had a nostalgic place for me, held a special place, and they had amazing stories behind them. And I listened to things like, gosh, some of these movies were being put out on Blu-ray and you had new commentaries recorded. Sam Furstenberg was a big one with Avenging Force and The Revenge of the Ninja, and I heard those and I had to learn more. I wanted to know every story there was, every story I could dig up behind every one of these movies. And it began as a project that was just going to be my favorite 50 favorite Canon movies and the stories behind them. And it just grew from there. That as each time I discovered a new one, I'd want to learn more about it. And so now it's turned into a series of 3 books. Coming out through Bear Manor Media. My publisher has been an awesome partner through this whole thing, but covering almost every Golden Globus movie produced by Canon from 1980 through 1994 when it's done. So the first volume covers 80 through 84. The second volume, which should hopefully be out by the end of this year, covers 85 through 87. So they're really the peak era of Canon films. And I go through, I look at the film, I break it down, where Canon was when they were producing, what point in the Canon's history each one came in, the film's individual history, the backgrounds of the people who were involved. I'd really love it if people had read the book after seeing the films and kind of look at this as all of the bonus features, a very rich set of bonus features that unfortunately very few Canon movies get that many. There are some companies putting out great DVDs of Canon movies, but so many of these only exist in, bare bones DVDs or only VHS tapes, which most people would only watch as like very grainy YouTube rips of these VHS. Yeah. So I'm trying to provide that for the whole Canon filmography.
Yeah, and I am holding currently the first volume here in my hands.
Oh, awesome.
And it's a fantastic book. And
thank you.
Just there are just tons of movies. Like I said, like I was familiar with Canon films. I knew some of the big ones, like we talked about, and then it's just like I open up this book and I'm like, oh my gosh, that was Canon too. Like, oh my gosh, or some of them I'm like, I have never heard of this one. What is this? And so this has been a really neat, really neat for me to get the book. And I'm going to be picking up the second and third volumes when those come out as well, just because they're so cool. And just some of these movies, I think it's just a really fascinating niche in kind of the history of movies and the history of film that kind of striking at the right time with home video and just some other, just this confluence of different, kind of forces at that time that led for Canon to kind of come in and provide us some awesome, action movies and things like that. I think it's really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, I'm definitely looking forward to the second, the second volume. And then also, just before I let you go, we were talking beforehand, of course, my podcast is aimed at role players. I try to talk about movies and film and story and books so we can get better at playing role-playing games. But you used to play, and you're looking to get back into the hobby. Isn't that right?
I'm working on it. It's fun. We're talking about this period because I think of the time when we were talking about we were young and walking out of the video store with R-rated movies. Yeah. A lot of the times those would be, I think of my youth, where a Friday you would go to somebody's house and your parents might not pick you up till Sunday.
Yep.
And there'd be a bunch of friends. And so that's when I think of when I had first been playing Dungeons and Dragons at a buddy's basement. So we would maybe rent, Revenge of the Ninja or like Delta Force. And that's what we'd watch on Friday night. And then Saturday we'd be playing. It was first edition back then, what we were playing. And yeah, so a lot of that period, I hold a very fond memories of. I DM'd mostly in those days because that's just the role I fell into. But I also, besides watching Canon movies, one of my favorite things to do, I remember as a kid when I was bored, is just look through monster manuals. And even if you couldn't use anything, there's just so many toys to play with and so many ideas where you can have the graph paper and draw out dungeons that most of the time I remember I couldn't get my friends to go anywhere near. The whole thing would go off the rails and never be used. But yeah, it's great memories. We played Dungeons and Dragons. I remember playing a little bit of Champions, and then I have very set memories of looking through Riff's books. Okay. And but I don't think we ever actually played that. I think that was somebody's older brother's collection who we had just sort of like poured through and been like, this looks amazing. What just never, because again, they weren't ours. They were an older brother that we had sort of, one of my friends had snuck it out of his bedroom and we were all looking at it. But yeah, so it's been years and years, but I'm kind of in a funny role-playing spot because I was working on these books for so long, and then both of my children are very young, but they're finally gotten to an age. I had two kids pretty close together, but that where they're old enough that I have more free time, more social time again. So during these years, I've accumulated a lot of role-playing books that I've never actually played, but stuff from the Free League. I love the Tales from the Loop. They're just gorgeous books. Even if I'd not gotten the chance to play them, they're beautiful artwork in them. Mutant Year Zero. I'm looking at that at my shelf right now. And then a lot of 5th edition stuff, because during earlier this year, I finally got to play in my first game. And gosh, since I was a kid, a little bit with a mixed group of friends once it was all looking safer for people to get together. And yeah, I'm going to turn it in the second volume. It's due to my publisher just in a few weeks. And I've been looking through these books and putting together a 3 nights game, D&D game that we can do in October. It's going to be sort of like spooky stuff. I'm playing a lot with the Ravenloft books.
Yeah.
There's I hope none of them are listening, but there's a whole section on there's like a little section listing in the monster section for killer puppets. And I think back to like 80s horror movies and things I loved as a kid, that killer puppets really appeal to me. So I've tried to build as much as I can around about an evil puppeteer. So
oh, that's awesome. And it sounds really cool. And it is, I mean, as you were saying that, I mean, that sounded like my childhood as well. We'd have some action movie, we'd rent some movie or some action movie, usually, at least one or two of them would be a Canon film. And then probably the Road Warrior and some other, Rambo movies were in there and stuff too. But then it was just
Highlander.
Highlander. Oh my gosh. I watched that movie so much.
That was a staple of my like pre-D&D movie nights.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I watched Highlander so much. I discovered it, I think, a little bit later. I think I discovered it like a couple of years after it had already come out, and just on VHS. And oh my gosh, I watched that movie until the tape was about ready to fall apart. But yeah, and yeah, just yeah, doing that, and then role playing like for an entire weekend, and then my older brother would like drive me and my friends over to their houses and drop them off like at 5 o'clock on Sunday, and then I'd come home and I'd just like crash because I hadn't slept but an hour the other times, because we were just watching movies and playing D&D or some other role playing game. It was just awesome.
School on Monday was always a drag too.
yeah, no kidding. I know, no kidding. And then all I was doing throughout the week was just dreaming of what movie and what D&D thing I could do, on the next weekend. Yeah.
We lived a very similar childhood.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And the math class was usually taken up with daydreaming about D&D or some action movie or something. But that's why I didn't do much with math, I guess. But anyway, Austin, it's awesome having you on the show. Where can people find the book and learn more about you and some of your other work and stuff?
Yeah, well, the book, you can find it anywhere that sells books online, direct from the publisher, Bear Manor Media, or even Amazon. As for myself, I'm on Facebook and Twitter, both of them at Canon Film Guide. Just very simple, but those places are fun if you are interested in Canon, you're interested in just B movies in general, 80s movies, action movies. I have been collecting this stuff and researching for over 6 years at this point, and I've accumulated such a large collection, and only a fraction of that can go into the books. So all of that's what I put on the social media pages. And so I advertisements, vintage interviews, video clips, things like that. It gives me an opportunity to share those things because I can't fit them in the books. At a certain point, you hit 1,000 pages and you just have to stop. But it allows me to keep the conversation going. It's also just fun because people can discuss them on there. We get, whether it's in the comments or on Twitter. I love talking Canon movies. I love talking 80s movies with anyone.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I will make sure and put links to your book and to your social media platforms and that in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now can just head over there and you will be able to find these links and check out Austin's book and some of the cool stuff that he posts on social media. So Austin, this was an awesome conversation. Just thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I had a great time.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Austin today. Thank you so much for indulging me on this kind of romp through the Canon Films action movies of the 80s. Oh my gosh, I love some of these movies so much, and it was just so awesome to talk to an expert like Austin who knows these movies inside and out. Keeping with the theme of the podcast, like I said at the top, I think we can take story ideas and improve our understanding of story, and with that, improve our game. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you're just learning about Canon Films, you should definitely check out Austin's book. I have provided a link in the show notes at dicegeeks.com where you can check out his book, The Canon Film Guide, as well as his social media platforms where he posts a lot of interviews and clips and just behind the scenes info that really adds a lot of depth to these movies. Please check those out. All right. If you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on here in the world of Dice Geeks. All right, guys. I give the pitch at the top. Just like, rate, review, subscribe. Tell a friend if people still talk to each other in person, if that's still a thing. Hopefully it is. You could just tell a friend about my podcast. That would be awesome. All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening. And until next Wednesday, keep gaming.